And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. Elvin Jones was one of the pioneers of jazz drumming in the 60s. His style was characterized by his dynamic accompaniments, innovative play and propulsive flow, traits that bridged the gap between bop, modal jazz and avant-garde jazz. He went on to influence several other jazz musicians like John Bonham and Ginger Baker. Much of this became apparent during his days with Coltrane, with whom he toured and performed from 1960 to 1966, recording several hit albums like A Love Supreme, My Favorite Things and Live at Birdland. Even before he joined Coltrane's band, he'd already made a name for himself alongside his brothers Hank and Thad, also collaborating on albums alongside Miles Davis, Sonny Rollins and others. He also had notable collaborations with artists like Wayne Shorter and Joe Henderson. He started out making a name for himself with Coltrane's group, then started out touring and performing alongside his own bands, typically featuring Joe Farrell, Steve Grossman and others, making some groundbreaking albums like Puttin' It Together and Merry-Go-Round. In later years, he formed his own band, The Jazz Machine, featuring Joshua Redman, Nicholas Payton and Ravi Coltrane. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about his biography. Elvin Jones was born in 1927 in Michigan into a musical family. He started out in the music scene after being inspired by circus performances. He started out performing in bands in school. From 1946 to 9, he was part of the Detroit jazz scene, then moved to New York City. In the early 50s, he recorded alongside musicians like Bud Powell, Miles Davis and Teddy Charles. One of his iconic appearances at the time was on Sonny Rollins' famous A Night at the Village Vanguard, released in 1957. In 1962, Elvin joined John Coltrane's quartet, where he performed alongside pianist McCoy Tyner and bassist Jimmy Garrison. The band were famous for their blend of Middle Eastern and Western musical styles and were driven by deeply spiritual music. Elvin Jones is the perfect complement to John Coltrane's saxophone style, with his hard-driving rhythms and innovative combination of West African rhythms and avant-garde styles, and together they produced some great albums like My Favorite Things, Ascension, A Love Supreme and Coltrane. Also around that time, Elvin started out recording and touring alongside his brothers Hank and Thad. One such album was the album Illumination, which also featured fellow Coltrane quartet bandmates like Garrison and Tyner. In 1965, Elvin left the Coltrane ensemble for Duke Ellington's orchestra. They toured Europe together. He also got immersed in his own projects like 1966's Midnight Walk on Atlantic and 1967's Heavy Sounds. He also appeared on collaboration albums alongside emerging musicians like Freddie Hubbard, Larry Young and Wayne Shorter. Around this time, Joe Farrell joined him in his musical productions, and the added name of Joe Farrell brought out a new shade to Elvin's drumming style. Joe Farrell was a multi-instrumentalist, primarily known for his saxophone playing. Two iconic albums that they recorded, Putting It Together and The Ultimate in the late 60s. His group expanded to include Jimmy Garrison on bass, saxophonist George Coleman and bassist Wilbur Little. Throughout the early 70s, he recorded for Blue Note Records, hallmarked by his innovative style of drumming and passionate approach to post-bop jazz. Some of his best albums at the time included Mr. Jones, Live at the Lighthouse and The Prime Element. In the late 70s, he formed a group under the name The Jazz Machine. Two of their best albums included a tribute to John Coltrane, A Love Supreme, a tribute to the great Coltrane featuring some of his best compositions, and In Europe and Youngblood, which saw him teaming up with up-and-coming artists like Ravi Coltrane, Joshua Redman and more. Despite declining health, Elvin remained an active musician into the 2000s. He would tour and perform and conduct jazz workshops in schools. He died on May 18, 2004, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most innovative drummers in jazz. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. Now it's time for some trending album news. Brian Eaton is a composer and instrumentalist hailing from Portland, and he's just released his 6th studio album, Trail of Contrition. The album's up for release on Eaton Records. The album promises a vibrant journey through jazz, rock, rhythm, blues and more. One of the standout tracks from the album is a cover of a track that once won Pat Metheny a Grammy called Travels. Eaton covers it in classic style, retaining its 80s feel while giving it a new texture through elements of American roots music. Another great jazz track in the album, Detour Ahead, a song that was a favorite with singers Sarah Vaughan and Billie Holiday. Eaton portrays this song with great innovation, a guitar melody that's both melancholy and joyous simultaneously. His rendition offers an innovative take on the song while maintaining its emotional essence. So this album is also a testimonial to Eaton's compositional skills. The album brings together the energy of rock, the essence of Americana music and the interplay of jazz. So basically, this album takes a listener through a dazzling sonic landscape, fusing various genres and styles into one. The music incorporates electric and acoustic guitars, bass, keyboards, drums and percussion instrumentals. The album Trail of Contrition is now up for download on all streaming platforms. For more information, please visit www.eatonrecords.com. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break, we'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of Elvin Jones' best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called Puttin It Together, released in 1968. This one was Elvin's debut for Blue Note Records. The performances feature an all-star band. There was Joe Farrell on tenor and soprano saxophone and flute, Jimmy Garrison, his colleague from the classic Coltrane quartet, on double bass. Joe Farrell belts out some great solos on this album. Garrison is very innovative on double bass, and Elvin Jones pushes things along with some great drumming. Elvin was released in 1961. This one's a compilation of straight-ahead jazz with a Count Basie style to it. There's a diverse range of music, from a beautiful ballad called You Are Too Beautiful to an energetic song called Buzz At. Some great sublime drumming by Elvin, and many critics have said this album was ahead of its time. And Live at the Village Vanguard, released in 1968, this one was taken from a live performance at the famous Village Vanguard in New York City. Joining Elvin on drums is George Coleman on tenor saxophone and bassist Wilbur Little. So that was some insight into what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Puttin It Together, released in 1968. This was Elvin's debut for Blue Note Records. The performances feature an all-star band. There was Joe Farrell on tenor and soprano saxophone and flute, and Jimmy Garrison, his colleague from the classic Coltrane quartet, on double bass. At the time of this album, Farrell was transitioning from sideman to solo musician, with some pretty good performances to his credit. Joe Farrell belts out some great solos on this album. Garrison is very innovative on double bass, and Elvin Jones pushes things along with some great drumming. One of the best tracks in this vein is the song Reza, on which Farrell's bass playing is very unpredictable and full of twists and turns. This is the opening track and sets the tone for the rest of the album. Elvin's very powerful on drums, he kicks off the music with a beautiful Latin groove, and Garrison enters with some solid accompaniment. There's a novel rendition of the Jimmy Hart classic Gingerbread Boy, which features a soft drum beat from Elvin, providing a more laid-back feel for Farrell's solo saxophone accompaniment. This one's a great jazz album and one of Elvin's best for Blue Note Records. In some ways, it was also a tribute to the great Jones Coltranes, in whose ensemble the players collaborating on this album first started out. There's a lot of Coltrane style in many of the tracks. Also, there's an original composition by each of the bandmates on this album. There's a beautiful tribute to his daughter by Jimmy Garrison called Sweet Little Maya. A beautiful bebop melody called Kaiko's Birthday March, a song written by Elvin Jones for his wife. There's also a composition called J. Ree by Farrell, a technically innovative piece that allows for great interaction between the trio. Elvin was released in 1961. This one's a compilation of straight-ahead jazz with a Count Basie style to it, recorded for Riverside Records. This is also Elvin's first solo album, and he recorded this album while he was still a member of John Coltrane's quartet. There's a diverse range of music, from a beautiful ballad called You Are Too Beautiful to an energetic song called Buzz At, composed by Elvin's brother Thad Jones. Accompanying him on this album are his brothers Thad and Hank, alongside Frank Foster on tenor and Frank West on flute. Most of the tracks were relatively new, except for one jazz classic, You Are Too Beautiful. There's two outstanding tracks on this album, two trio songs featuring Hank, Elvin and bassist Art Davis. There's another great Ernie Wilkins composition called Pretty Brown. On this song there's some great drumming by Elvin. Another one called 4 and 6, supplemented by great drum rhythms, bass and piano. Some great sublime drumming by Elvin, and many critics have said this album was ahead of its time. Live at the Village Vanguard was released in 1968. This one was taken from a live performance at the famous Village Vanguard in New York City, a famous jazz haunt at the time. Joining Elvin on drums is George Coleman on tenor saxophone and bassist Wilbur Little. There's some great dynamic tracks on this one. Also, there's a guest appearance by trumpeter Hannibal Peterson. Elvin's collaboration with the saxophonist is particularly fiery and intense. He's especially dynamic on the track By George. So that was some insight into some of Elvin Jones' best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. Now it's time for some trending festival news. The Smoke Jazz Club is one of New York City's most prestigious jazz haunts, and they're set for a month of dazzling performances, and here's the lineup. Pianist Jackie Terrason, the Eric Alexander Quartet, Jazz Messengers alumni, and a special Valentine's Week with vocalist Mary Stallings and more. So Smoke Jazz Club is all set for a dazzling month of festivities in February, and here's some of the names on the lineup. Mary Stallings, the celebrated vocalist, takes the stage during Valentine's Week, that's February 12th to 16th, with a dazzling performance featuring her warm vocals. She's one of the most celebrated jazz singers of this generation, specializing in blues and gospel music. She's joined on this performance by other legends like Aaron Goldberg, Peter Washington and Joe Farnsworth, promising an emotional and eclectic performance. There's Smoke Jazz Club regular Jackie Terrason and his trio performing from February 5th to 9th. Terrason's piano style is distinguished by smooth sophistication that sets him ahead of the pack. His trio have reshaped the sonic landscape of piano playing in their decades of dramatic performances. He's known for his inspired repertoire, dynamic solos and dramatic ensemble interplay. So this is a great chance to watch this celebrated pianist live, combined with Smoke Jazz Club's acoustic settings and immersive atmosphere. Finishing off the festivities on a glamorous note are Eric Alexander and his quartet performing on February 19th to 23rd, followed by the Jazz Messengers alumni. The Jazz Messengers feature an all-star lineup, names like Carl Allen, Benny Green, Donald Harrison and others, and their performance is in line with their co-inspiration, the music of Art Blakey. They will be paying tribute to the jazz saxophone legend from February 26th to March 2nd. For more information, please visit www.smokejazz.com. So that was some trending festival news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Elvin Jones' best albums of all time. Stay tuned.